The paper goes around the table first. In a low cabin lit by a single lantern somewhere on the Atlantic in the years around 1720, a ring of barefoot sailors listens while one of the few among them who can read calls out a list of rules. Every man shall have an equal vote. Every man shall have an equal share. If a man loses a limb in the fight, the company shall pay him from the common stock. Then each man steps forward, signs his name or makes his mark, and swears to it, on a Bible if the ship has one, on a boarding axe if it does not. These men are pirates, the most wanted criminals of their age, and the paper they have just signed is a constitution. In a world where kings ruled by divine right and a sailor could be flogged half to death on one officer's word, the outlaws of the sea elected their captains and voted them out again, split power between rival elected officers, fed every man alike, and insured one another against the loss of an arm or an eye. This is the story of how the cruelest workplace in the Atlantic produced, for one short generation, a working democracy, how it rose, how it governed, and why the empires decided it could not be allowed to live. Keep your eye on three small things: a signed sheet of paper, a pile of silver coins on a chest lid, and an iron cage at a harbor mouth. The ship stands 3 days out of Port Royal, and the men have come aft to ask about the bread. It is 1700, or near it, and the scene repeats on 100 merchant decks in every year of the age. The rations cut again, the water gone green in the casks, and the crew, 12 or 14 men, working a vessel of 200 tons through all weathers, sending one careful spokesman to the quarterdeck to ask, hat in hand, for the allowance written into their contracts. The captain hears him out. Then he has the man seized to the rigging and flogged, and notes the insolence in the log, and the law of every seagoing nation in Europe stands behind him as he does it. Sailors of the age had a name for the thing they lived inside: the wooden world. It was a fair name. A deep-sea ship was a country of its own, with its own law, and that law was one man. At sea the captain held powers no king ashore had wielded in centuries. He could beat a man, have his food, chain him to the deck, and in practice he answered for it to no one. A master who killed a sailor with the lash might face a court when he came home. The courts, manned by men who owned ships and insured cargoes, almost never found against him. The historians who have gone through the records of the period put it bluntly: the deep-sea sailor of 1700 was the freest-ranging worker on earth, and among the most enslaved in his daily life, and the contradiction was structural, because the same isolation that made the ship a marvel of commerce made it a sealed room with the door locked from inside. The cruelty was not a flaw of temperament. It was the business model. A merchant captain commonly held a share in the voyage, and every penny not spent on the crew's food was a penny kept. The salt beef shorted, the bread stretched with peas, the water casks topped off with harbor scum, all of it flowed quietly into the owner's accounts. Wages worked the same way. A common seaman in peacetime earned perhaps 24 or 25 shillings a month, less than a poor farm laborer, once the months of idleness between voyages were counted, and he was paid only when the voyage ended, which meant the debt ran always in one direction. Masters docked pay for breakage, for lost gear, for days of sickness. Some contrived to make the whole wage vanish. A sailor who deserted a brutal ship forfeited everything he was owed, and so the lash and the ledger worked together. The worse a man was treated, the more it cost him to walk away. The king's service was no refuge. The pay of an able seaman in the Royal Navy had been fixed at 24 shillings a month in 1653 under Cromwell, and it would still be 24 shillings in 1797 when the fleet finally mutinied over it, 144 years without a raise, or arrived as a paper ticket redeemable only at a distant pay office, which a hungry man sold to a dockside shark at half its face value, and the Navy did not wait for volunteers. The press gang, a squad under an officer, empowered to seize seafaring men bodily off the streets and out of merchant ships, could take a sailor home from a 3-year voyage within sight of his own roof and carry him straight to a man of war for 3 years more. Resistance was a crime. The law called it desertion, and desertion in wartime could carry death. Death needed no court's help. The sea trades killed on a scale ashore reserved for plagues. Scurvy, the slow rot of a body starved of fresh food, gums black, old wounds reopening, emptied whole ships on long passages. Fevers waited in every tropical port. The work itself, crippled men by routine, hands torn on frozen rigging, ruptures from hauling, falls from the yards that ended in the sea or on the deck. A sailor by 40 was an old man, scarred and bent, and everyone who hired him knew it. One who survived was Edward Barlow, a Lancashire man who went to sea in the 1650s and kept, across more than 40 years of voyages, a journal in which he painted the ships he served and totted up the bargain of his life. The poor seaman, he wrote in his blunt way, got the leavings of every trade, the worst food, the hardest usage, and the smallest share of the wealth he carried across the world for other men. Ashore, the sailor could see exactly what his complaint was worth. At the mouth of the Thames, on a point of mud at Tilbury, where every outbound ship passed close, the body of Captain William Kidd hung in an iron cage. Kidd had been hanged at Execution Dock in 1701 from piracy and murder. The rope broke on the first attempt, and they hanged him again, and then his corpse had been tarred, bound in hoops of iron, and slung up over the river to creak in the wind for years. The point of a gibbet, the authorities were frank about it, was instruction. Every apprentice boy and pressed man sailing out to the East or the Indies sailed past the lesson. This is what becomes of sea rebellion. Mark it well. The men marked it. They were, by the nature of their work, unusually fit to mark things. Sailors were the most traveled human beings of their age, fluent in the prices and politics of 4 continents, bound together by a craft so specialized that landsmen could not replace them. They worked in crews, ate in messes, survived by trusting one another with their lives aloft, and they talked. In every port from Boston to Calabar, the same grievances moved with them: the withheld wage, the stolen ration, the captain's untouchable violence, until the talk amounted to a kind of shared verdict on the wooden world. What the verdict lacked was an alternative, proof that a ship could be run any other way. The proof existed. It was older than most of the men who would act on it, and it lived to the west, in the islands, where for 2 generations cattle hunters, runaway servants, and cast-off sailors had worked out a different way to share a dangerous trade, rules made by the men who would live under them. The sailors of 1700 knew the stories the way all workmen know the legend of a better shop. What none of them yet knew was how soon and in what numbers they would get the chance to put the old custom back to sea. The better shop had begun with cattle. In the early 1600s, the Spanish had all but abandoned the northern coast of Hispaniola, the great island that is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, leaving behind herds of feral cattle and pigs that multiplied through the hills. To that empty coast drifted the unwanted men of 3 empires: sailors who had jumped ship, indentured servants run from the cane fields, Protestant refugees from Catholic France, soldiers of beaten armies. They lived by hunting, and they cured the meat in the manner of the island's vanished Taino people, smoking it slowly on a wooden frame over a green wood fire. The frame was called a boucan, and the hunters became buccaneers, in English, buccaneers. They were a society with no women to speak of, no priests, no magistrates, and no money worth stealing. And out of that bare ground, they grew their own institutions. Men paired off into partnerships, sharing everything they owned, and inheriting from one another like spouses. Disputes were settled by the company of hunters, not by any officer. When the Spanish tried to drive them off by slaughtering the herds, the hunters moved to the small island of Tortuga off the coast, looked at the treasure ships beating up the channel past their door, and changed trades. The skills transferred. A man who could drop a running bull with 1 musket ball found a Spanish helmsman no harder a mark. What made them more than a rabble was the agreement. Before a buccaneer crew sailed, the whole company drew up and signed a written contract, the custom of the coast they called it, or the chasse partie, the hunting agreement. It set out, in advance and in writing, exactly how any plunder would be divided. So many shares to each man, a share and a half or 2 for the captain, set bonuses for the surgeon and the carpenter, rewards for the first man to sight a prize or board her. And it set out something stranger, a tariff of flesh. A man who lost his right arm in the fight was to be paid about 600 pieces of 8, the big Spanish silver dollars that served as the common money of the Atlantic, a left arm or a leg somewhat less, an eye or a finger about 100. We know the numbers because a surgeon who sailed with them, Alexandre Exquemelin, wrote the whole system down in a book published in 1678 that became a scandalous bestseller across Europe. Workmen's Compensation, written by the workmen at a time when a sailor of the regular trades who lost an arm was simply put ashore to beg. The rule that bound it all was the one the buccaneers said aloud: no prey, no pay. No one, not the captain, not the owner of the ship, earned a coin unless the venture did. The captain ate what his men ate, slept no softer, and held his place by their consent and his own conduct. Targets were debated and voted by the whole company. To sailors raised under the wooden world's one-man law, all of it was upside down, authority running upward from the crew, the proceeds split by formula a man could read for himself, the maimed paid first. The buccaneers were brutal men in a brutal trade. Their raids on Spanish towns involved torture and worse, and Exquemelin recorded that too, but among themselves they had built the most equal large-scale workplace in the Western Hemisphere. For a generation, the empires found them useful. England had taken Jamaica from Spain in 1655 and could not defend it. The governors of Port Royal discovered the buccaneers issued a commission, a letter of marque, the paper that turned robbery into lawful war against a named enemy, made a cheap navy. The greatest of the commissioned was Henry Morgan, a Welshman who rose from nothing to command whole fleets of buccaneers under Jamaican colors. In 1668, he took the treasure port of Portobello with a few hundred men. In 1671, he marched well over 1,000 of them across the isthmus, through jungle and ambush, and took Panama itself, the richest city of the Spanish Pacific, which burned to the ground in the taking. Every man of that army had signed the agreement first. The shares were divided under the eyes of the whole company, and the company grumbled loudly that Morgan had shorted them, which tells you what they thought the rules were and to whom they thought the rules applied. Morgan's reward is the part worth remembering. The Panama raid had embarrassed London. England and Spain were briefly at peace, so he was arrested, shipped home, celebrated in every tavern on the way, knighted by the king, and sent back out as deputy governor of Jamaica, where he spent his last years hanging buccaneers. The establishment had made its position plain. Plunder was a tool, the custom of the coast a temporary convenience, and the men of the agreement could be reclassified from instrument to vermin the moment the politics shifted. Shift they did. By the 1690s, the wars had moved, the commissions dried up, and Port Royal, the buccaneers' roaring capital of taverns and punch houses, had literally sunk. An earthquake on the 7th of June, 1692, dropped 2/3 of the town into the harbor in minutes. And preachers across 2 continents called it the judgment of God on the wickedest city on earth. The buccaneers faded, but the custom did not. It survived where such things survive, in the talk of working sailors, carried from forecastle to forecastle, that there had been ships where every man signed the rules he sailed under, voted the targets, ate from the same pot as the captain, and was paid for his wounds from the common stock. The custom of the coast became the folklore of a class. It wanted only an event large enough to put thousands of armed, trained, desperate seamen out of work at once, with the habit of violence fresh on them and nothing to lose. Europe, as it happened, was about to supply exactly that. In 1701, the great powers stumbled into a war over the Spanish throne that would burn for a dozen years and put more sailors under arms than any conflict before it, and then, in 1713, it would put them all on the beach. The war put weapons in their hands first. The War of the Spanish Succession, Queen Anne's War, the colonists called it, ran from 1701 to 1713. And at sea it was fought as much by license as by navy. Governments on both sides issued letters of marque by the hundred, turning private ships into privateers, legalized raiders entitled to take enemy merchantmen and keep the proceeds. For a common sailor, the difference was night and day. A privateer paid in shares, not fixed wages. Discipline was lighter, the food better, the company chosen. A lucky cruise could pay a foremast hand more than 5 years of honest wages. Thousands of men spent a decade learning that sea robbery was a trade, that it paid by consent and formula, and that they were good at it. Then the music stopped. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, ended the war and the licenses together. The Royal Navy, swollen to nearly 50,000 men at the height of the fighting, cut itself down toward 13,000 within about 2 years. The privateer fleets dissolved overnight, and every port in the English Atlantic filled with discharged seamen, competing for berths that no longer existed. Wages, which war had driven up toward 50 shillings a month, fell back by roughly half. Masters with a glutted market to draw on, squeezed harder than ever. Why coddle a crew when 20 hungry men stood on the quay for every place? The sailors of 1714 were more numerous, more skilled at violence, and worse treated than any generation of seamen before them, and they were concentrated in a handful of ports, with nothing to do but talk to one another. Some had already slipped over the line. In the Bay of Campeche on the Mexican coast, hundreds of English seamen worked between voyages as logwood cutters, felling the dense tropical wood that dyers prized, in swamp camps that were half labor gang and half pirate commune, beyond the reach of any magistrate. Spain regarded them all as trespassers, and after the peace its coast guards burned the camps and turned the cutters out. Hard men with axes, robbed as they saw it, of a living by a paper signed in Europe, drifted to Jamaica with one skill left to sell. The peace was manufacturing its own enemies, faster than anyone in London understood. What it had not yet manufactured was an occasion. The sea provided one. On the 31st of July, 1715, the annual Spanish treasure fleet, 12 sail, carrying the accumulated silver of several war-starved years home from Havana to Spain, was caught by a hurricane in the narrow channel along the east coast of Florida. 11 ships drove onto the reefs and sands in the dark and broke apart along 30 miles of coast. Only a French consort clawed clear of the land and lived. At least 1,000 men drowned, by most accounts. Survivors crawled ashore onto a beach with no town within 100 miles, and scattered through the surf behind them, in water shallow enough in places for a man to stand in, lay silver and gold worth millions of pieces of eight. Word moved through the Caribbean like fire in dry grass. The Spanish flung up a salvage camp on the dunes and set divers, many of them enslaved African and Indian men, working on hell breath in the wreck-strewn shallows, bringing the treasure up. Every tavern from Havana to Boston heard of it within weeks. A king's ransom lying loose on an open beach, guarded by a fever-thinned company of soldiers at the end of nowhere. To the paid-off privateersmen of Jamaica, it scarcely felt like crime at all. The silver was Spanish, the war with Spain was barely cold, and a man with a boat could simply go and take some. They called it fishing the wrecks. Hundreds went. The man who turned the rush into robbery was Henry Jennings, a Jamaican privateer captain of means and respectability. In the winter after the storm, Jennings led a company of around 300 men in 3 vessels not to the wrecks, but to the Spanish salvage camp itself, stormed it from the beach, and marched off with tens of thousands of pieces of eight of recovered treasure. By some accounts, 87,000. It was an act of open war against a power England was at peace with. No paper covered it. And when Spain's ambassador raged, Jamaica's governor disowned the raiders he had quietly encouraged. Jennings and his men were now pirates in law, whatever they called themselves, and they were pirates with a fortune, which posed the question every successful robbery poses. Where could such men safely go? Not home. The logical place had to be near the Silver Coast and the shipping lanes, beyond the reach of governors, with water too thin for a man of war, and a harbor fat enough for a fleet of small craft. Every paid-off sailor in the western Atlantic could have named it. In the Bahamas, 3 days' sail from the wrecks, lay an island the Empire had effectively thrown away. Its governor long fled, its little town burned twice in the late war, and never rebuilt. Through 1716, the sloops came in by ones and twos, then by dozens. Jennings' respectable raiders, the burned-out logwood men, the wage-starved and the flogged and the simply ambitious, all converging on a half-ruined settlement called Nassau. They were about to discover that nobody was in charge of it, and to decide together that this was less a problem than an opportunity. The island was called New Providence, and its gifts were exactly the ones an outlaw needed. Its harbor, sheltered behind a long ridge of sand and rock, could hold 500 small craft. The bar across its mouth carried water enough for a sloop, the fast single-masted workhorse of the islands, but not for the deep-bellied warships that might come hunting. It sat a few days' sail from the Florida wrecks, and squarely beside the Straits of Florida, the one channel through which the silver of Spanish America and the sugar of the islands funneled home to Europe on the Gulf Stream. A crew could water, refit, and careen there, heave a ship over on a beach to scrape the weed and worm from her hull, the maintenance every wooden vessel lived or died by, and be back astride the richest sea lane on earth within a week. Best of all, the law had left. The Bahamas were a proprietary colony, owned and neglected by a syndicate of English lords. French and Spanish raiders had sacked Nassau repeatedly in the late war, and by 1716, the proprietor's government existed mostly on paper. What remained was a burned fort, a church with no roof, a couple of hundred settler families scraping by, and then arriving month on month, the sloops. The newcomers ran up huts of driftwood and palm thatch along the beach, roofed the old ruins with sailcloth, and opened, within a season, the institutions their trade required: taverns, gambling tents, and a market. Stolen cargo sold cheap and asked no questions, so honest traders came to do dishonest business. Sloops down from Harbor Island and Eleuthera, captains over from the Carolinas, all buying sugar and silk and slaves at half the lawful price. Plunder needs a fence, and Nassau made itself the fence of the Western Atlantic. By 1717, the pirates and their hangers-on numbered somewhere between 500 and 1,000, several times the settled population, and colonial officials' letters home took on a new pitch of alarm. These were no longer scattered sea thieves. The governor of Virginia and his colleagues warned. They had a base, a fleet, a recruiting pool, and a swagger. Some reports had them talking of Nassau as a commonwealth of their own, answerable to nobody. The men themselves had a plainer phrase for joining the life: going on the account, the working sailor's term for shipping out under the old custom, where pay was a share of whatever the venture took. The account had reopened, and every abused foremast hand in the Atlantic knew the address. Ashore, the place ran on a rough federalism of crews. There was no mayor and no court, but neither was there the war of all against all that sermons promised. Each company answered to its own articles and its own elected officers. Disputes between crews were patched up by their quartermasters or argued out in the taverns. Theft within the community, the one unforgivable crime in a town of thieves, was punished by the injured crew with beating, banishment, or worse. Reputation did the work that law did elsewhere. A captain who cheated his men found he could not recruit. A tavern keeper who watered rum for pirates found cheaper customers. It was government by standing and consent. The forecastle's habits scaled up to a town, crude, violent at the edges, and far more orderly than it had any right to be. Two men stood nearest to chiefs in it, and they hated each other. Henry Jennings, the gentleman raider of the salvage camp, held court among the older privateersmen, who still thought of themselves as the king's irregulars on an extended holiday. Benjamin Hornigold, a tough professional who had been working the straits in small boats since the war's end, led the other faction: the young, the landless, the men who had never owned anything the law respected. Hornigold had built up from a periagua, a big open canoe, to a mounted sloop he named the Ranger, the strongest ship in the harbor, and he played patron to a generation. Half the famous names of the next 5 years apprenticed in his company. They called themselves, with a grin, the Flying Gang. Yet even Hornigold carried a scruple that marked him as the old kind. He held to the privateersman's fiction that he was still, at bottom, an Englishman raiding England's enemies, and he refused to plunder English ships. His crews found the distinction increasingly quaint. The flags that had starved and flogged them were English as often as Spanish. The account recognized no kings, and a captain's conscience was costing every man aboard money. So in 1716, by most accounts, they did the thing that defines the whole era. They called a council on the deck of the Ranger's consort, put the question to a vote, and turned Benjamin Hornigold out of effective command of his own flotilla. The founder of the Flying Gang, deposed at sea by a show of hands, with no mutiny, no blood, and no apology. In his place, the vote raised a penniless young Englishman named Samuel Bellamy, who had arrived in the islands the year before with nothing but a reputation for nerve. The men called him Black Sam. For the black hair he refused to hide under a wig. Ashore in Nassau, the deposition changed almost nothing. Hornigold kept his ship, his standing, and his tavern credit, and that was precisely the point. Command in this society was an office, not a possession. The men who granted it could withdraw it, and a legend of the trade had just submitted to the count of hands like anyone else. Bellamy, the beneficiary, would shortly carry the logic to sea in the boldest crews of the age, but the vote on the Ranger's deck was only as strong as the rules behind it, and the rules, by 1716, were no longer a memory of the buccaneers. Crew by crew, the pirates of Nassau were writing them down. The writing down happened in the same way on 100 ships, and it usually happened within a day of the ship becoming a pirate at all. a prize was taken, or a crew mutinied, or a band at Nassau bought a sloop with pooled plunder. The company gathered between decks or under an awning, and someone, the surgeon, the sailing master, any man with letters, drew up the articles of agreement. They were read aloud, clause by clause, because most of the men who would live under them could not read. They were debated and sometimes amended on the spot. Then every man came forward in turn and signed his name or scratched his mark, and swore an oath to keep them, on a Bible where the ship had one. The crew of John Phillips, taking to piracy in 1723 in a stolen Newfoundland schooner, had no Bible aboard, so they swore their articles on a boarding hatchet, which the age agreed was binding enough. We know what the document said because several survived their signers. The fullest set comes from the crew of Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the age, preserved in the Great Chronicle of the Era, published in London in 1724. The first article is the whole revolution in a sentence. Every man has a vote in affairs of moment. Not every officer, every man the day he signed, whatever he had been the day before. Pressed Welsh fisherman, runaway apprentice, freed or escaped African. The same article continues with the second pillar. Every man has equal title to the fresh provisions and strong liquors taken, and may use them at pleasure unless scarcity makes rationing necessary, and rationing, when it came, was voted. On the ships these men had fled, the captain's table groaned while the forecastle chewed wormy bread. Here, written first as if it mattered most, was the rule that everyone ate from the same stock. Then came pay. Under Robert's articles, the captain and the quartermaster drew 2 shares of any prize. The master, boatswain, and gunner drew a share and a half, other officers a share and a quarter, and every other man exactly 1. Set that against the lawful world the signers came from, or a merchant captain might earn 5 or 6 times a seaman's wage, and a privateer commander, with the owners behind him, took home a fortune, while his foremast hands counted shillings. The steepest hierarchy these outlaws would tolerate, from the newest hand to the commander who led them into gunfire, was 2 to 1. The shares were paid out in the open, on deck, the coin and plate counted into piles under every eye, pieces of 8 stacked on a chest lid in the sun, 1 pile per man, the arithmetic of the new world made visible. Cheating at the count was the deadliest sin aboard. Under Robert's articles, a man who defrauded the company of so much as $1's value faced marooning, set ashore alone on some uninhabited quay with a bottle of water, a pistol, and powder, to die at his own pace. Theft from the common stock was treason here, and they punished it like treason. The articles legislated welfare with the same bluntness. A man who lost a limb in the company's service, Robert's code promised, was to receive $800 from the common stock before any shares were divided, with proportionate sums for lesser hurts. Other cruise articles set tariffs of their own, each company pricing its risks by vote. The buccaneer's old tariff of flesh had become standing social insurance. The crippled paid first, ahead of captain and quartermaster alike, funded off the top of every prize. There were pensions of office for the maimed too. A man past fighting could stay aboard at a cook's or sailmaker's post and keep drawing a share. The wooden world threw its broken men on the parish. The account, alone among the maritime employers of the age, wrote them into the founding document, and the articles governed conduct in terms any shipmate could recite. Lights and candles out at 8 in the evening. A man wanting to drink later drank on the open deck, in the dark, where he endangered no one's sleep and no magazine. No gaming at cards or dice for money. The 1 coral engine every sailor knew banned outright. Weapons kept clean and fit for service, on inspection. No boy and no woman to be carried to sea. A man who smuggled a woman aboard in disguise faced death, a clause aimed less at morals than at the murderous rivalries a closed ship could breed. No striking another of the company aboard ship. Quarrels were to wait for shore, where the quartermaster took the 2 men to the beach and saw the thing settled at sword and pistol, under rules, a duel, supervised, instead of a feud below decks. Even the ship's musicians got a clause in Robert's code, rest on the Sabbath day, by right. It is worth standing back from the parchment to say plainly what it was. Each crew wrote its own articles. There was never one pirate code, and a man moving between ships signed anew, but the family resemblance across every surviving set is unmistakable. Consent given by signature, law known because it was read aloud, equality of provision, near equality of pay, fixed compensation for injury, and punishment by stated rule rather than by an officer's temper. The men who drafted these documents had, almost none of them, ever voted for anything ashore. England would not let most of them near a ballot. Their floggings had required no trial. Out here on the far side of the law, they built from memory and grievance the exact mirror image of the ship they had fled, and they got it in writing, because a sailor's whole working life had taught him precisely what a gentleman's unwritten promise was worth. One more thing the signing did, and the signers knew it. The articles made every man aboard equally guilty. A signature on that paper was, in any admiralty court in the world, a confession to piracy. The prosecutors of the next decade would wave these very sheets at juries, and men would hang by the evidence of their own names. To sign was to burn the road back to the lawful world. The crews understood this, and made the burning ceremonial, with toasts and gunfire. The paper bound them to one another, and barred them from everyone else, all in one stroke of a tarred finger. A constitution, though, is only as good as the offices it creates. What made the pirate articles work, what kept a ship of armed, drunken, desperate men from devouring itself in a month, was the strangest invention of the whole experiment. A command structure with a built-in opposition. The signers did not merely limit their captain. A pirate captain was hired the way the men he commanded had never been, by election, on merit, with the electors standing in reach of him. The company wanted a fighting seaman, bold of temper, skilled in navigation, lucky in prizes, and it chose by show of hands or shouted acclaim, sometimes after open campaigning by rival candidates. Birth counted for nothing, which in the world of 1717 was itself a small revolution. The gentleman's son and the freed slave stood in the same count, and what the vote gave, the vote took away. Crews across the period turned out captains for cowardice, for cruelty, for hoarding, for plain bad luck. One chronicler of the age remarked that the office passed among them as easily as a hat, and meant as little, the moment the wearer disappointed. While he held it, the captain's power had edges a navy man would have found laughable. In chase or in battle, his command was absolute. The articles themselves typically said so, for no ship survives a committee in a broadside, and there his authority ended. He set no course without the company's voice, declared no target, punished no man, and touched no larger ration than the newest hand. On many ships he did not even keep his cabin. Any man of the company might walk into it, the chronicler noted, swear at him, seize his punch bowl, and the captain could answer with nothing but words. He messed from the common kettle. His birth was a birth. The men had taken the one figure their old world had taught them to fear like God and shrunk him, deliberately to a foreman with a sword. The genius of the system was the second office. Alongside the captain and against him, the company elected a quartermaster, and the pirate quartermaster was nothing like the supply clerk the Navy meant by the word. He was the crew's tribune, their elected trustee, magistrate, and counterweight. He kept the common stock in the accounts, made the division at the share-out, and led the boarding of every prize, deciding what was taken and what left. He alone could punish small offenses, and even then a flogging required the company's vote. In disputes between crewmen he sat as judge. The Chronicle of 1724 reached for a political word, and called him a sort of civil magistrate aboard, who could check the captain himself. Power to lead in violence in one man, power over food, money, and justice in another, both elected, both removable, and the big questions reserved to the vote of all. The men who wrote that arrangement had never read a page of political philosophy. They had simply met the problem philosophy addresses, what to do about power, with their backs against it. Above both officers stood the council, the whole company in assembly, usually on the open deck, every signer's voice equal. Councils chose where to cruise and when to break the crews off, voted the fate of prisoners and the taking or refusing of fights, tried serious offenses against the articles with the accused heard and the sentence put to the count. The proceedings were loud, profane, and frequently drunken, and they decided matters of life and death for every man present, which concentrated minds wonderfully. More than one captured merchant officer, held aboard while his ship was rifled, recorded his astonishment at watching the process work, the most feared men on the ocean, governing themselves like a rowdy town meeting, and being obeyed. The proof that none of this was theater came in November 1718 in the Windward Passage, on the sloop of the most defiant pirate then sailing. Charles Vane was a veteran of the Nassau Brotherhood, a hard and famously vicious captain who had spat at the king's pardon when nearly every other chief took it. Running the passage that autumn, his sloop raised a sail by night and closed to attack, and the stranger ran out her guns and answered with a broadside. She was a French man of war, twice Vane's force. It was, by any sober reckoning, the seaman-like call. The frigate could have shot his sloop to splinters. But his men had wanted to board her, and the articles knew nothing of sober reckonings. The next day the company called its council on deck, branded the retreat cowardice, and put the captaincy to the vote. Vane was deposed on the spot. A scene that followed is the whole Constitution in miniature. The man who had terrorized the Atlantic stood on his own deck while the Count went against him, and then submitted to it. There was nothing else to submit to. The guns were in the company's hands, as the articles had always quietly ensured. The crew voted him a small sloop from their flotilla, let him take the handful who would still follow him, and watched him sail away diminished. In his place they raised the quartermaster, the office born to check captains. A flamboyant Nassau man named John Rackham, called Calico Jack for the bright printed cotton he wore. No mutiny, no knife in the dark, a transfer of power by ballot, at sea, among outlaws, conducted more cleanly than most successions in the lawful kingdoms they had all deserted. Set the arrangement beside the world it floated in, and the strangeness glows. In the Britain of 1718, perhaps one free man in 6 could vote for anything at all, and no sailor afloat chose the officer who could flog him. The pirates held elections at will, recall at will, separation of powers, and trial by one's peers decades before any philosopher made checks and balances fashionable, and a long lifetime before any nation tried universal male suffrage. They did it without theory, for the most practical reason on earth. Every man aboard had seen what unaccountable power did with a rope's end, and not one of them would sign away his person to it again. What the offices and the ballots protected day to day was not an idea, but a standard of living. The food, the shares, the surgeon's chest, the rough fellowship of the mess. That bargain, and who exactly was admitted to it, is where the account must be weighed honestly. The democracy of the deck had a waterline, and below it lay the same darkness the whole Atlantic floated on. Ask why a sober sailor signed, and the honest first answer is that the life was simply better, materially, measurably better. In every column a foremast hand kept accounts in. Pirates ate like the captains they had fled, fresh meat from raided livestock, turtle and fish from the islands, white bread and wine out of every prize, and all of it shared by article, with rationing only by vote in scarcity. They worked less. A merchant owner drove 12 men to handle a ship. A pirate crew of 80 on the same tonnage stood easy watches, with hands to spare for every haul. They had medicine. Crews prized a captured surgeon above almost any cargo, paid him a full share, and alone in the maritime world had pre-funded his patient's disasters through the article's compensation clauses. And they had idleness, the rarest luxury of their class. Music from the ship's band, dancing, gambling for fun where the articles banned it for money, and the long tavern liberty of the careening beaches. One crew, the Chronicle records, grew so fond of staging mock trials of one another for piracy, a sailcloth-wigged judge ranting from a tree stump, that the play had to be broken up when it cut too near the bone. The share-out was the sacrament of the whole arrangement. After a cruise, the company gathered on deck, the quartermaster opened the common stock, and the plunder was told out under every eye, coin counted into equal piles on a chest lid, plate weighed, cloth and cargo valued and divided, or sold off at Nassau and split in silver. First by article came the compensation. The man who had lost an arm or an eye took his $800 off the top, while the rest stood and watched. A ceremony of solidarity repeated every division. Then, pile by pile, name by name, each man stepped up for a stack of pieces of 8 that was, to the shilling, the same as his neighbor's. Men who had been cheated of wages their whole working lives would describe that moment in confessions and trial testimony with something close to wonder. Who got a pile is the next honest question, and the rosters answer it. Pirate crews were the most international workforces on earth. English, Irish, Scots, Welsh, French, Dutch, Scandinavian, Spanish Indians, Portuguese, colonial Americans of every port. And they were, startlingly for the age, substantially black. The capture records are unambiguous. On many crews of the period, a quarter or more of the men were of African birth or descent, escaped from slavery, or recruited out of taken slave ships. Aboard some companies the proportion ran higher. Many were full members under the articles, signing, voting, bearing arms, drawing shares at a time when every lawful institution in the hemisphere held men of their color as property. Some rose to office. The trade's folklore remembered black quartermasters and boatswains, and witnesses at trials described armed black pirates among the boldest of boarding parties. For a runaway slave, the account was the only polity in the Atlantic world that might count him a citizen. Might, because the same records forbid any rosier word. Pirates were not abolitionists. They robbed the slave trade because the slave trade owned the best ships and the richest cargoes on the African coast, and a slaver's cargo included people whom crews treated by whim and arithmetic. This man recruited and armed, that 100 sold at the next friendly port, others kept at the pumps as unfree labor below the very deck where the articles ruled. The democracy had a waterline, above it votes and shares, below it the hold, and the hold's logic was the Atlantic's. No paradox in the period is sharper, and none is more honestly documented, than free black pirates standing armed watch over chained Africans their company meant to sell. In the spring of 1717, Samuel Bellamy, Black Sam, the man the vote had raised over Hornigold, took, after a 3-day chase, the Whydah, a London-built slave galley of 300 tons, named for the great slave port of the African coast, homeward bound with the proceeds of a delivered human cargo in her strongroom. Bellamy made her his flagship, 28 guns, fast and new, and in her he became briefly the most successful pirate alive, with the plunder of some 50 ships, by the later count, in her hold. Coin, gold dust, ivory, indigo. Several of her freed captives joined his crew at the Articles. The Chronicle of 1724 put in Bellamy's mouth the era's plainest self-justification, delivered to a captured captain who declined to join him. The rich, he is made to say, rob the poor under cover of law, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. And whether Bellamy ever spoke the words, or a London writer gave them to him, thousands of sailors read them and recognized the accounting. The sea audited Bellamy before any court could. On the 26th of April, 1717, beating up the coast of Cape Cod in the dark, the Whydah drove into a screaming northeast storm and went on to the sandbars stern first, broke her back, and rolled. Of the men aboard, around 145 of them, 2 reached the beach alive. The dead came ashore for weeks, and with them the wreckage of the floating republic. The locals stripped what the surf delivered. The crown sent an agent to glean what the locals missed, and the sand took the rest. It kept it for 267 years. In 1984, divers working from the old depositions found the wreck under the bars off Wellfleet, and in 1985 they raised a bronze bell cast with the words "The Whydah Galley, 1716," the first pirate ship ever identified beyond argument on the seafloor. Out of the sand since have come thousands of pieces of eight from mints across Spanish America, gold dust from the African coast, fine pistols, and the leg bone of a pirate recovered beside a small silk-stockinged shoe. The archaeology, like the rosters, refuses to simplify. The same excavation that raised the democratic silver, coin in the unsorted thousands, the common stock awaiting a share-out that never came, raised West African gold jewelry, currency of the trade in human beings, and the bell of a ship built expressly to carry them. The pirates' Commonwealth was real, and it floated on the Atlantic the slave trade had made. Both facts came up out of the sand together, fused by 3 centuries of salt. What the system promised its members, though, it delivered richly enough that the empires began to notice a frightening pattern. When pirates took a merchant ship, the merchant's crew, more often than any owner cared to admit, asked to sign. Robbery they could insure against. Defection was something else, and the man about to teach the empires exactly how much else was, at that moment, fitting out a captured French slaver of his own, and deciding that what could not be outgoverned might be outperformed. Terror, too, could be run as a system. The man understood, before anyone else in the trade, that the product was fear. Edward Thatch, Teach, some records spell it. He signed little, and we know his birth only by tradition. Probably Bristol, probably a privateersman in the late war, served his pirate apprenticeship under Benjamin Hornigold out of Nassau, and emerged from it in late 1717 commanding a prize of his own, La Concorde, a big French slave ship, taken off Martinique, which he renamed, with a Jacobite curl of the lip, the Queen Anne's Revenge. He pierced her for 40 guns, frigate strength, in a trade of 6-gun sloops. Then he built the weapon he is remembered for. He grew the great Blackbeard up to his eyes and plaited it into tails. He slung 3 brace of pistols in holsters, across his chest like a bandolier. And going into action, the chronicle says he tucked slow-burning match cord under the brim of his hat so that his head smoked, and he looked. The writer reached for the only comparison that served, like a fury out of hell. The costume was a calculation, and the calculation was about avoiding battle, not seeking it. A pirate crew's capital was its ship and its men, and gunfire spent both. Every prize that surrendered unfought was pure profit. So the accounts captains ran terror as policy. The black flag itself, the skull, the skeleton, the hourglass, the bleeding heart, designs the crews sewed themselves and called in their own slang, the Jolly Roger, was a published promise. Strike your colors at the sight of it, and you would be robbed methodically and let go. Resist, and the red flag followed, and no quarter. The system only worked if both promises were kept, and the pirates kept them with actuarial discipline, which is why of the hundreds of vessels Thatch took in his short career, the record shows him killing, by most accounts, not one captive before his final morning. Merchant crews knew the tariff. They saw the smoking beard above the rail, weighed their owner's cargo against their own skins, and hauled down their flags. His legend was doing the broadside's work, free. By the spring of 1718, the brand had a fleet behind it. The Revenge, 3 lesser sloops, perhaps 300 to 400 men, the strongest pirate force then afloat. And in May, Thatch took it somewhere no one imagined pirates would go, against a city. He stood off the bar of Charleston, South Carolina, the richest port of the southern mainland, and simply shut it. For the better part of a week, his squadron took every vessel that tried to enter or leave, 8 or 9 of them, one carrying a party of notables including Samuel Wragg, a member of the colony's ruling council, and his 4-year-old son. And then the demand went ashore, and it was the strangest ransom of the age. Not silver, though the town vaults held plenty. The town gave it to them, after days of farce in which the pirate envoys got drunk in the streets, while the council scraped the apothecaries. A chest worth perhaps 300 or 400 pounds, mercury preparations for the syphilis that scourged every crew, instruments, drugs against fever and flux. The hostages were landed stripped half-naked but unharmed. The squadron melted over the horizon, and the colonies digested the lesson Charleston had just been taught. A private navy of the dispossessed had blockaded an English capital, extracted a public health subsidy at gunpoint, and sailed off without firing a broadside or hanging for it. The medicine chest told the sharper truth. This was not a monster's whim, but a polity providing for its people, the article's welfare clauses pursued by other means, the common stock banked in physic instead of coin. What Thatch did next showed the cold side of the same intelligence, turned for the first time against his own. A company of 300 was a parliament too large for the plunder at hand. Shares were thinning, and the captain had been, by the standards of his trade, oddly unlucky in keeping wealth. In June 1718, entering Topsail Inlet on the North Carolina coast, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran hard aground on the bar and broke, and the grounding, several of his own men later swore in depositions, was no accident. In the sorting out that followed, Thatch stripped the flotilla of its best plunder and best men into a single small sloop, contrived to maroon a couple of dozen protesters on a sandbar, and sailed away from the rest. Hundreds of shipmates suddenly beached, defrauded by ballotless fiat of everything the articles had promised them. The shareholders' company had been asset stripped by its star. It was the one classic betrayal the pirate constitution had no clause against. The founder who outgrows the firm. Then he showed the age the other exit. That same month, Thatch presented himself to Charles Eden, the royal governor of the thin, poor colony of North Carolina, and took the king's pardon, the general amnesty then on offer to surrendering pirates. He settled in the hamlet of Bath, bought a house, married, his 14th wife, says the chronicle, with a wink we cannot audit, and became, for a season, a gentleman of the province, dining with planters who found him magnificent. The retirement was a costume too. By late summer he was cruising again in his sloop, quietly taking French vessels offshore and selling the goods through complaisant Carolina hands. The governor's own customs collector, his enemies charged, sat in the network. Thatch had grasped that a weak colony's law was not a wall but a market. Protection could be bought like sailcloth, and a pardon made better armor than 40 guns. By the autumn of 1718, he lay at his ease inside Ocracoke Inlet, careening among the sandbanks hosting a notorious weeks-long revel of visiting crews, Vane's company among them, the punch bowls and bonfires going night after night until the mainland talked of a new Nassau forming in the marshes. He was perhaps 40 years old, famous on 2 continents, lawfully pardoned, unofficially protected, and the most recognizable private citizen in the Western Hemisphere. The brand had never stood higher, but a brand is a target painted by its owner, and the men who finally moved against him understood his own science perfectly. There is no theater like a head on a pole. The empire was done out-frightening Blackbeard. It had decided instead to out-advertise him, and the campaign was already funded, in a colony whose laws could not reach him, by a governor who had stopped caring about the law. London moved first not with a fleet but with a sheet of paper of its own. On the 5th of September 1717, the king proclaimed a general pardon. Any pirate who surrendered to a governor within a year would be forgiven every act of piracy committed before a cutoff date early in 1718. No trial, no forfeiture worth fearing, a clean slate. The drafters understood the arithmetic of the thing they faced. Nassau held more fighting seamen than any squadron the Admiralty could spare. Storming it would be expensive and might merely scatter the contagion. But a brotherhood held together by shared outlawry could be dissolved by retail mercy. Every man offered his own private door back to the lawful world. Every crew turned into a debating society over whether to take it. The paper landed in Nassau that winter like a depth charge. The taverns divided, the older men, the Jennings faction, privateersmen at heart who had always told themselves the war had merely run long. They took the pardon by the score, sailing for Bermuda and Jamaica to sign their names and keep their plunder. Benjamin Hornigold took it. The man who built the flying gang, deposed once already for loving England too much, crossed over in Tyre, and would shortly turn pirate hunter against his own apprentices. The refusers gathered around harder men, Charles Vane loudest among them, who grasped the pardon's fine print exactly. Forgiveness for the past, the gallows still waiting for the next prize, and the next prize was the only living any of them had. Vane's faction celebrated the king's mercy by firing on the king's messengers and held the harbor through the spring as the surrendered men streamed out of it. The second half of the policy arrived on the 26th of July, 1718, a small squadron standing in past the bar, and aboard the flagship a one-time pirate's nightmare of a governor. Woodes Rogers was the most famous sea officer of his generation, the Bristol privateer who in the late war had taken a crew around the world in 3 years, captured a Manila treasure galleon, and along the way rescued from a desert island a marooned Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk, whose story, reworked into a novel called Robinson Crusoe, would outlive every other name on the squadron's books. Rogers came not as an avenger, but as a salesman of the pardon, carrying soldiers, settlers, stores, and a royal commission as Captain General and Governor-in-Chief of the Bahamas. The proprietors had been bought out, the abandoned colony was the Crown's again, and the Crown's intention was embodied in the squadron's cargo of farm tools and its list of civil appointments. Nassau was to be governed. Vane answered for the irreconcilables that same night. He stuffed a captured French prize with powder and combustibles, and sent her down the dark harbor into the anchored squadron, a fireship, the oldest terror of crowded roadsteads. The men of war cut their cables and scattered in the dark, while the floating bomb burned past, and in the confusion Vane took his sloop out the shallow eastern channel at dawn, colors flying, firing a derisive gun as he went. It was magnificent, and it changed nothing. Rogers anchored, landed, and was received on the beach. This is the scene to hold, by a double line of several hundred pirates, drawn up in rough order, who cheered the new governor in and fired their muskets in the air. Most of Nassau, given the chance to be subjects again at no cost, took it on the spot. What followed was less a conquest than a long, feverish administration. Rogers rebuilt the fort with pardoned pirate labor, mounted guns, organized companies of militia out of men who had been robbing the king's trade in the spring. Hornigold, now his most trusted instrument, sent to sea to chase his old colleagues. The island fought him with its climate as much as its character. Within months, an epidemic fever had killed scores of his settlers and soldiers. And the navy ships, their escort duty done, sailed away despite his pleading. When Spain, at war again, sent an invasion force against the island in 1720, it was met and turned back by the rebuilt fort and a militia of pardoned pirates fighting, this once, for the king. Rogers begged London for support that rarely came. spent his own fortune on the walls, and wrecked his health holding the line. The empire would eventually let its indispensable governor sit in a debtor's prison, between appointments. Empires are absorbing machines, but they digest their servants too. The test of the new order came in December. A party of pardoned men had relapsed, slipped out, taken vessels, been hunted down by Hornigold among the islands and hauled back in irons. 10 of them faced a court of the governor and his counselors, in the shadow of the half-built fort, and the charge sheet was their whole world turned inside out. Piracy, mutiny, and felony, proved by witnesses who had been their shipmates. Rogers possessed no clear authority for what he did next. His commission did not plainly empower civil courts to try piracy, and he did it anyway, knowing the message mattered more than the jurisdiction. 9 were condemned. On the 12th of December, 1718, 8 of them were hanged in a row on the rampart overlooking the harbor, above the beach where the Brotherhood had cheered itself hoarse 5 months before. The 9th, a young man named George Rounceville, was reprieved at the foot of the ladder, by most accounts for the sake of his loyal Devon family. The condemned died with an era's strange aplomb. One harangued the silent crowd of his hundreds of former brethren on the futility of repentance. Another kicked off his shoes to cheat an old proverb about dying with them on. No hand stirred to save them. The crowd watched the trap fall and went back to its taverns and understood. A gibbet now stood at the harbor mouth of the pirates' own capital, and the new colonial seal, struck soon after, spelled the policy out in Latin around its rim. Piracy expelled, commerce restored. The Commonwealth of Thieves was finished as a place. But a polity whose citizens are ships does not die with its capital. It scatters. Vane was still out raging up and down the American coast. Thatch lay in his Carolina sanctuary, pardoned and poaching. The refusers had simply lost an address, and the empire knew it. Killing the Republic now meant killing its famous men, one expensive hunt at a time. The season of examples was about to open. The hunt that killed Blackbeard was, strictly speaking, illegal. Alexander Spotswood, the Iron Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, had watched the Ocracoke revels through informers' eyes and concluded that a pirate court was forming in the next colony south, under the protection of that colony's own governor. North Carolina's jurisdiction was not his. He did not care. He bought intelligence from Thatch's old shipmates, hired 2 shallow draft sloops with his own and the colony's money, posted rewards on top of the king's, and borrowed officers and men from the 2 royal warships idling in the Chesapeake. Command of the expedition went to a veteran first lieutenant named Robert Maynard, with about 60 men, no cannon, the sloops were too light to bear them, and orders that contained no ambiguity anyone remembered. They found the Adventure at dawn on the 22nd of November 1718, anchored inside Ocracoke Inlet among the shoals, with perhaps 20 men aboard, and most of them heavy from the night's drinking. What followed lasted minutes and decided the era. Thatch cut his cable and fought his sloop through channels he knew blind, and as Maynard's 2 vessels crowded after him through the narrows, he yawed and gave them his whole tier of guns at close range. The single broadside wrecked the smaller sloop and killed or wounded a third of the attackers. Maynard's own deck was a shambles. The lieutenant then played the one card terror has no answer for. He sent his unhurt men below with their weapons, left his decks all but empty, and let the Adventure come down on what looked like a beaten hulk. The pirates threw their grappling hooks and boarded into a trap as old as sea war. The hatches opened and the hidden crew came out shooting. Thatch and Maynard met face to face by the rail, fired their pistols at touching distance. Maynard's ball struck home, Thatch's missed, then went to swords where the bigger man snapped the lieutenant's blade at the hilt. The smoking beard filled the world for one swing more. A Highland seaman of Maynard's company cut Thatch across the neck from behind, and the next blows brought him down. When they examined the body that had frightened 2 continents, they counted. The official report said 5 gunshot wounds and some 20 cuts. Maynard had the head struck off and slung from his bowsprit, sailed it up the coast, and saw it spiked on a pole at the mouth of the Hampton River in Virginia, where the channel still bears the name Blackbeard's Point. The state had hired better theater. The most famous head in America now advertised the other firm. 2.5 weeks later, and 300 miles south, the Gallows took the era's strangest recruit. Stede Bonnet was a rich sugar planter of Barbados, a retired militia major with a library, who in 1717, to the bafflement of everyone, including the Chronicle hints, himself, had bought a sloop, named her the Revenge, hired a crew for wages like a merchant, and gone pirating as if purchasing a commission in a fashionable regiment. The men of the account never knew what to do with him. He was no seaman. Thatch, briefly his partner, gently relieved him of his own ship and ran it for him. The wage-paying landsman remained aboard as a sort of mascot of melancholy. What he proves is the rule he broke. The articles, the elections, the shares, none of it was nature among pirates. It was a deliberate politics of the dispossessed, and a gentleman hobbyist simply reproduced the only command he knew, and was humored because his money was good. Cornered in the Cape Fear River in September 1718 by armed sloops from Charleston under Colonel William Rhett, Bonnet fought a 5-hour battle aground, surrendered, escaped custody, dressed in women's clothes, the story ran, was retaken half-starved, and went before a court whose judge, Nicholas Trott, lectured him on damnation, with citations. He wept, petitioned, and pleaded. It did him no good, and on the 10th of December 1718, the gentleman pirate hanged at Charleston's White Point, the nosegay of flowers in his bound hands wilting in the harbor wind, and went into the marsh mud below the tide line with 29 of his wage-earning crew, who had preceded him a month before. That same week, the men who had deposed Charles Vane were learning how short the era's second chances ran, and Vane himself was discovering the price of constitutional defeat. Deposed by the vote in November for refusing the French man-of-war, packed off in a small sloop with his few loyalists, he had rebuilt, taken vessels, restocked, kept his name alive, until a hurricane in February 1719 drove his sloop onto an uninhabited islet in the Bay of Honduras and beat it to pieces. He survived as a castaway, ragged among the turtle fishers' camps, until a passing vessel took him off, and then bad luck finished the work. An old Port Royal acquaintance, a former buccaneer turned honest captain named Holford, came face to face with the rescued beachcomber and knew exactly whom he was looking at. Vane was delivered to Jamaica in irons. The colony tried him at leisure, hanged him at Gallows Point in the spring of 1721, and then spent the real money. His corpse was tarred, bound in iron hoops, and hung up on a gibbet on a sandy islet at the harbor mouth of Port Royal, where every vessel entering the old buccaneer capital passed beneath him. Kidd's cage at the Thames mouth had been the first word of the Empire's argument. Vane's creaking over the Caribbean's front door was the latest, and the argument was the same on both oceans. The sea road runs under our scaffold now. Look up. In 13 months the state had taken the Brotherhood's defiant capital, its most famous monster, its gentleman curiosity, and its loudest irreconcilable, and converted each into civic furniture, a rampart gallows, a head on a pole, a body at the low tide mark, a corpse in hoops. The lesson was crafted for sailors, and sailors read it exactly. Recruitment thinned, prizes began to fight back. The easy world of 1716 was gone. What the lesson could not reach was the thing that had built that world in the first place. The articles were still being signed, out where the examples could not be seen, and the next signatures to matter would include two that no admiralty clerk, drafting the form of indictment with its long line of he and him, had ever imagined. The man the vote had raised over Vane was never the equal of the office. John Rackham, Calico Jack, for the bright printed Indian cotton he wore against the age's wool and leather, was a Nassau original. Charming, theatrical, a fine small boat seaman, and a small thinker, whose career as captain ran to coasting sloops, fishing canoes, and stolen anchorage liquor. He took the pardon at Nassau when the weather turned official, lost his plunder to the governor's fees, and idled around the new colony's taverns, where he met and set the age talking about a married woman named Anne Bonny. She was Irish, born near Cork, carried to the Carolinas as a child by a father escaping a scandal. The chronicle gives her early life in novelistic detail that no document can check, and she had come to Nassau as the young wife of a small-time sailor who turned informer for Roger's government. She despised him. In Calico Jack she found a man scaled to her own appetite for trouble, and when the affair grew too public for even Nassau's tolerance, the governor's court threatened her with the whip at her husband's suit. Rackham proposed the traditional Nassau solution to legal difficulty. In August 1720, he, Bonny, and a dozen restless others stole the fastest sloop in the harbor, a 12-ton flyer called the William, and put back on the account. Somewhere in the company, already aboard or shortly recruited, was a second woman and her road there beggars the first. Mary Read was English, raised, the chronicle again, with its taste for romance as a boy from infancy by a mother stretching a dead son's inheritance. She had served as a footboy, a sailor, and then a soldier in Flanders, where she fell in love with her tent-mate, revealed herself, married him, and kept an inn with him near the garrison until he died. Widowed, she went back into men's clothes and to sea, was taken by pirates in the West Indies, and signed. Whatever embroidery the London printers added, the corps stood up in court later under oath. 2 women, in men's jackets and long trousers, full members of a pirate company under its articles, handling powder, standing watches, going over the side with the boarding party, swearing with the best. Rogers knew within days. The proclamation he published that September, hunting the William, named the runaways for the world, and 2 names on it made it the most reprinted government notice of the age, Anne Fulford alias Bonny and Mary Read. There was no precedent for it. The account was the most male world the era possessed, its very articles commonly barring women from the ship, and yet here was the governor's own paper certifying that the floating republic had, in fact if not in law, admitted 2 citizens no kingdom on earth would have armed. The William worked the Jamaica coast through the autumn, a flea operation, fishing boats coasting sloops, a stolen net here and a terrified crew there, profitable mostly in the way of staying fed. Fame and takings had parted company entirely. Rackham's was now the most famous small-time crew on the ocean. It ended at Negril Point on a night in late October 1720, with an economy that reads like a parable of the whole era's end. A privateer sloop under one Captain Jonathan Barnett, commissioned by Jamaica to sweep its coasts, found the William anchored in the bay, her company sprawled on deck over a bowl of rum punch with a boatload of visiting turtle fishermen. Barnett hailed. Rackham's answer was a swivel gun. Barnett's broadside took the William's boom and her hope of running. And then, by the testimony every account leans on, the company of the most notorious sloop in the Caribbean went below. The men, captain included, tumbled down the companionway and stayed there as Barnett's boarders came over the rail. The fight on the deck, such as there was made by the 2 who would not go down, Read and Bonny, blades and pistols out, cursing the dark, while the republic of votes and shares hid under their feet. The story that Read fired her pistol down the hatchway into the huddle, killing one of her own shipmates, screaming at them to come up and die like men, comes from the Chronicle rather than the trial record. But the trial record needs no help. The witnesses against the women were unanimous that they were active, armed, willing, and last to yield. The court sat at Spanish Town, Jamaica, in late November 1720, under the black formality of the Admiralty. Rackham and the men were condemned first and hanged within days at Gallows Point. Calico Jack's corpse tarred, hooped in iron, and hung on the gibbet on the little harbor islet that bears his name to this day. Rackham's Cay, the 3rd such signpost the Empire had erected over its sea roads in 3 years. Bonny, the Chronicle swears, was granted a last interview with him and gave the Age its most quoted obituary. She was sorry to see him there, she said, but if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. Document or invention, it was the verdict of the articles themselves. Courage was the one tax the company levied, and he had skipped it. Then the 2 women stood up, were condemned to the same rope, and pleaded their bellies. It was the old common law plea: a pregnant woman could not be executed until delivered, for the child had committed no felony. The court ordered the examinations. Both pregnancies were confirmed, and the sentences were stayed. Mary Read never met the postponed rope. Fever swept the Spanish Town jail, and she died in it in April 1721. The parish register of St. Catherine records the burial of Mary Read, pirate, and Anne Bonny walks out of the documents entirely. No execution recorded, no release, no grave. Tradition has her Carolina father buying her home to respectability, and history has nothing at all. The era's most famous woman simply steps off the page. What the 2 of them had proved was awkward for every party. For the Empire, that the pirate menace was not a few monsters, but a porous recruiting society. If it could take in women, it could take in anyone, and anyone was the thing it feared. For the legend makers, heroines beyond invention, who required none. And for the account itself, the lesson cut deepest. The Williams articles had been real enough to die under, and on the last night, only the 2 members the world said could not be members had honored them. The Republic's citizenship had never depended on what a signer was, only on what the signer would stand to. Far to the east, off another continent entirely, a Welsh sailing master, who had been forced aboard a pirate ship against his will, was at that moment demonstrating the same clause from its other end, that the account could elect even its conscripts, and that its greatest career was about to be its last. The greatest career in the history of piracy began as a kidnapping. In June 1719, the pirate Howell Davis, a wit who had taken whole forts by impersonating naval officers, stopped a slave ship called the Princess off Anamabu on the Gold Coast of Africa and pressed several of her crew, among them the third mate, John Roberts, called Bartholomew, a tall, dark, sober Welshman of about 37, who had spent 20 unrewarded years at sea and did not want to be a pirate. 6 weeks later, Davis walked into a Portuguese ambush on the island of Principe and died in it, and the company met to elect a successor. The senior men, the crew's grandees, styled themselves with a grin at Westminster. The House of Lords put forward several of their own. The vote went instead to the conscript of 6 weeks' standing. The reasoning was pure account. Roberts was the best navigator aboard and afraid of nothing. It mattered little, one elector said, who was captain among equals, so long as he had courage and skill in the trade. Roberts is said to have accepted on the arithmetic that since he had dipped his hands in muddy water, he had better be a commander than a common man. His first motion carried unanimously, back to Principe, where they avenged Davis on the town by night. The Constitution had just performed its strangest trick, promoting a prisoner to head of state inside 2 months, and the next 31 months would prove it had chosen better than any admiralty board of the age. What followed was the account run at industrial scale. From mid-1719 to early 1722, Roberts took something on the order of 400 vessels, the most of any pirate of the era by a wide margin, across a parish that ran from Newfoundland to Brazil to the African coast. The exploits became tavern scripture. Off Brazil he sailed alone into a convoy of 42 Portuguese merchantmen, cut out the richest, taking among other things a cross of diamonds destined, the story ran, for the King of Portugal, and was gone before the escorting men of war beat back upwind. In June 1720, he stood into the harbor of Trepassey in Newfoundland with black colors flying and drums and trumpets sounding, and the crews of 22 anchored vessels took one look and abandoned their ships to him without a shot. In the Caribbean, his squadron so terrorized the islands that for stretches of 1721, shipping simply stopped moving. He renamed each successive flagship Royal Fortune, as if the office, not the hull, were the ship. The man the company had elected ran it with a rigor that delighted and occasionally chafed his electors. Roberts was that rarity of the trade, a near abstainer who preferred tea to rum, and his ship under its articles was the strictest in the business. The 8 o'clock lights out, the gaming ban, the Sabbath rest for the musicians, the duels ashore rule, all enforced. He dressed plainly at sea and gorgeously for occasions, kept the lords in line by force of tongue and the occasional pistol, and held together for nearly 3 years, across 3 continents' coasts, a floating polity that at its height ran to 4 ships and well over 250 men. Among them the muster of his last day would show some 70 black members. He was, witnesses agreed, the finest sea officer of the age in any service, and the lawful services had offered him 20 years before the mast for it. The men summed the bargain in the motto the Chronicle put in their mouths, a merry life and a short one. Then came Whydah, and the place where this story refuses to romanticize. In January 1722, Roberts descended on the great slave port of Whydah on the African coast, the same harbor the Whydah galley had been named for, and took the whole road in an afternoon. 11 slave ships surrendered without resistance. He ransomed them back to their captains at 8 pounds of gold dust apiece. One captain of a ship called the Porcupine refused to pay. Roberts ordered the ship burned, and his boarding party, finding the vessel's enslaved cargo chained below and the unlocking slow, fired her with about 80 human beings still in irons. Those who broke free and leapt drowned in the harbor, or were taken by the sharks that worked the anchorage of every slave port. The rest burned. It was, even by the cold ledger of the age, an atrocity, committed not by the trade the pirates mocked, but by the freest crew afloat, in the ordinary course of extortion. The articles aboard the Royal Fortune promised votes, shares in compensation to its 70 black signers. The same company burned 80 chained Africans as a pricing dispute. Both facts are true. The account, at its very height, contained them both. And any history of its democracy that omits the porcupine is advertising. The reckoning was 3 weeks out. The Royal Navy had finally stationed real force on the African coast. 250-gun ships, Swallow and Weymouth, under Captain Challoner Ogle, and at dawn on the 5th of February 1722, the Swallow raised Robert's squadron careening at Cape Lopez. Ogle feigned flight. The great ranger, Robert's consort, swallowed the lure, chased him over the horizon, and was mauled into surrender out of earshot of her consorts. 5 days later, the Swallow came back for the flagship. Roberts, at breakfast on captured beer, understood at the last possible moment what ship was standing in, and met her in costume. He dressed, the famous description runs, in a rich crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, a gold chain about his neck with a diamond cross hanging to it, a sword in his hand, and 2 pairs of pistols slung over his shoulders on a silk sling. His plan was seamanlike and desperate. Run the Swallow's broadside once at full sail and be past her into open water. The single exchange of fire settled it. Grape shot from the man-of-war's tier swept the Royal Fortune's deck and tore out Robert's throat, and he sat down against the gun tackles and died, before the mainmast, gun smoke for incense. His men, executing the one order he had left standing for the day his luck ran out, wrapped the body in sailcloth, weighted it with his arms, and put it over the side, still dressed in crimson, denying the Empire its gibbet. The wreck of the fight surrendered by midday. The Navy fished for the corpse and never found it. Ogle would be knighted for the morning's work, the only English naval officer ever knighted expressly for taking a pirate, and the Admiralty's accountants could read the prize list as well as anyone. The account's greatest firm, 4 ships and 250,000 men under an elected force man, had required a 50-gun ship of the line to extinguish, and the age's whole apparatus of patrols and pardons had taken 31 months to bring him to a single morning's battle. But extinguished it was. Bobbing in the Swallow's wake were 254 prisoners, and a sheaf of captured papers, among them a signed sheet of articles, and what the Empire did with those men and that paper, on the coast where the trade ran, would be the largest mass trial the account ever received, conducted in the one building on earth that made its ironies unanswerable. The prisoners were carried to Cape Coast Castle, the great English slave fort on the Gold Coast, and the choice of courtroom, however practical, stands as the era's most articulate accident. The castle was the headquarters of the Royal African Company's trade in human beings. Whitewashed walls and batteries above the surf, and beneath the parade ground, cut into the rock, the dungeons where captives were held by the hundred in the dark to await the ships. In the airy rooms above those vaults, in March and April of 1722, the Crown convened the largest piracy trial in the history of the Atlantic. Empire's 2 great systems of maritime order, the slave trade and the gallows, stacked one on top of the other in a single building, with the men who had defied both locked between. The law that sat in judgment was itself a recent invention, tooled for exactly this work. Under the old statute, a pirate taken abroad had to be shipped to London for trial, an ocean of expense and escapes. The Act of 1700, made permanent as the crisis deepened, fixed that. It let any 7 commissioned officials and sea officers, anywhere in the world, sit as a court of admiralty and hang men where they were taken, with no jury, no counsel for the accused, and no appeal. It was justice redesigned as logistics, the gallows brought to the crime, instead of the criminal to the gallows, and at Cape Coast it processed the wreck of Robert's company with the efficiency of the trade downstairs. The court of naval captains and company officials sat for weeks, working through the muster of the Royal Fortune and the Ranger man by man, each prisoner answering alone to the same printed charges. The hinge of nearly every case was a piece of paper, the company's own articles, taken with the ship and laid before the court. 2 questions organized the whole proceeding. Had the prisoner signed? And had he acted willingly, taken his share, borne arms, gone aboard a prize, voted? The forced men, conscripts like Roberts himself had once been, pleaded exactly that compulsion, and the court, to its credit by the age's lights, listened. Surgeons pressed for their skill, musicians forced to play the company into battle, craftsmen kidnapped entire, dozens walked on proof they had never signed and never shared, but a name or a mark on the articles was, very nearly, a sentence. The document the signers had built to bind one another, read aloud below decks so every man would know his rights, was read aloud again in the hall above the dungeons, clause by clause, as a roll call of the condemned, the equal vote, the equal provision, the $800 for a limb, entered into the record not as politics, but as proof of combination. No piece of evidence in the era's hundreds of piracy trials hanged more men than the account's own founding paper. The arithmetic of the verdicts, preserved in the printed proceedings, maps the whole apparatus in one table. Of the 254 men taken alive off Cape Lopez, disease in the holds killed several score before judgment. Around 170 stood trial. The court acquitted 74, the forced, the lucky, the well-spoken. It condemned 72 to death, and remitted 20 of those to terms of penal labor in the Royal African Company's mines and to transportation. Of the remainder, 52 hanged. They went to the rope in batches over 3 weeks, on the open shore in sight of the anchored shipping, and the court spent its real eloquence after death. 18 of the bodies were dipped in tar, bound in iron hoops, and hung on gibbets on the headlands overlooking the sea lanes, the highest points for miles, chosen as a lighthouse keeper chooses, so that every slaver, every merchantman, every man of war raising the Gold Coast for years afterward, made its landfall on a horizon dressed with the account's dead. Kidd at the Thames mouth, Vane and Rackham at Port Royal's door, and now a whole coastline of Africa. The empire had built its counter-archipelago of iron cages, and it ringed the Atlantic. One column of the ledger the court never opened at all. Aboard Robert's ships at the taking had been roughly 70 black men, boarders, gunners, signers, and sharers among them, members of the freest polity their world afforded. They received no trial, no charge, no printed line of proceedings. The Royal African Company took them as it took any cargo landed at its fort, and they went down into the dungeons under the courtroom and out through its gate to the ships, sold into the trade their company had robbed, their citizenship and the account annulled by complexion in the space of a clerk's entry. The age recorded their number and not one of their names in that hour. If the gibbets on the headlands were the empire's argument against the pirate republic, the dungeon ledger was its argument about who had ever been allowed to be a citizen of anything, and of the two, it was the second that would outlast the century. The Cape Coast Assize broke the back of the account as a system. It had killed at one sitting more pirates than any year of patrols. More efficiently still, it had advertised a procedure: capture anywhere, trial on the spot, the articles as automatic proof, that stripped the life of its last ambiguity. The same machinery now ran continuously around the ocean. Courts at Boston, Charleston, Providence, Kingston, and the leewards hanged crews and job lots through the early 1720s, and by one modern count between 400 and 600 men went to the gallows for piracy in the single decade after 1716, roughly a tenth of everyone who had ever signed. Merchant wages, as it happened, were rising in the same years. The pardons had skimmed off the reconcilable, the mathematics of going on the account, once so plain that whole crews defected at the sight of the black flag, had inverted. What remained at sea after 1722 was a remnant for whom the arithmetic no longer mattered, men past pardon and past calculation, whose last cruises would close the era at its darkest and prove, in their way, the final tribute to what had been lost. What was left after the great trials was not a politics, but a temper. The crews still out after 1722 were smaller, hunted, and barred from every door. The pardons expired, the friendly harbors garrisoned, the fences hanged or frightened honest, and their cruises read less like the old account than like a long arson. The exemplary figure of the remnant was Edward Lowe, a Westminster-born Boston rigger turned captain, whose name became a byword the age used the way a later one would use the worst of its criminals. Lowe's companies took ships by the hundred in 2 or 3 years and burned much of what they took. And where the old chiefs had run terror as a tariff, surrender and be spared, Lowe ran it as appetite. The deposition books of the early 1720s fill with his signature cruelties: captains mutilated for the location of a coin, prisoners killed for sport between watches. The newspapers printed it all, and the trade's last recruits sailed knowing exactly what they were joining. Even his own men gagged at last. By most accounts, Lowe's final crew put him over the side into an open boat after he murdered a sleeping shipmate, and the record loses him, picked up, one version says, by a French ship and hanged at Martinique, Simply swallowed, says another. The man without articles got an end without witnesses. The remnant's smallness showed in other ways. John Phillips, the Newfoundland carpenter whose crew had sworn its articles on a boarding hatchet for want of a Bible, cruised 8 months in a stolen schooner with a company that never passed a few dozen, pressing carpenters and fishermen who watched him with cold eyes. In April 1724, the forced men rose, axed him on his own deck, and sailed the schooner into Boston with the captain's head pickling in a barrel. The conscript's verdict on a Commonwealth that had become mere captivity with paperwork. The Atlantic's last pirate captains were being killed by their own prisoners. Recruitment, the lifeblood of the old account, the merchant crews who had once cheered the black flag aboard, had dried to nothing, because the bargain underneath it had died. There were no more shares worth a hanging, no Nassau to spend them in, and no week without news of a crew swinging in chains at some harbor mouth from Boston to the Bight. The endgame produced one last political speech from the era's least likely orator. William Fly was a young boatswain who in May 1726 led the crew of a Bristol slaving snow, a small two-masted merchantman, in a mutiny off the Carolinas, threw the brutal captain and mate to the sharks, renamed the vessel Fame's Revenge, took 5 small prizes in about 5 weeks, and was overpowered by his own forced men and carried into Boston in June. The trial was a formality. The theater came after. Cotton Mather, the most relentless gallows chaplain in America, worked for days to wring from Fly the public penitence the ritual required, the broken sinner warning others from the cart. Fly refused the script. He went to the scaffold on the 12th of July, 1726, with a nosegay in his hand, bowing to acquaintances in the crowd, inspected the noose, rebuked the hangman for not understanding his trade, and retied the knot himself with a boatswain's hands, and then offered his moment of repentance, delivered instead the account's closing argument. He would not blame himself, he said. Let masters pay their sailors their wages when due, and use them better, and there would be no such things as pirates. Mather printed the scene himself in a furious pamphlet, and so the last word of the Golden Age went into the record verbatim, dictated by the condemned to his prosecutor, an industrial relations grievance, delivered from the gallows with the rope already fitted. Fly's body went into the iron hoops on Nix's Mate, the harbor islet off Boston, the same year the Navy's returns and the governor's letters began reporting, for the first time in a decade, clean coasts. The collapse was total and swift. The best modern reckonings put the Atlantic's pirate population near 2,000 around 1720. By 1724, perhaps a quarter of that. By 1726, effectively none. Some 4,000 men, all told, had sailed under the articles in the 10 years the account had run. And the endings divide among the gallows 400 to 600, the seas uncounted, the pardoned who melted back into the ports, and the transported and enslaved. No new Nassau formed. The handful of last names, a crew off the Carolinas in 1727, a flicker in the leewards after, were mopped up as criminal incidents, because that is all they now were. Piracy as a fact would never leave the oceans. Piracy as a polity, the elections, the shares, the signed and sworn law, ended in the 1720s, on the gallows on purpose. Why it ended is worth stating with the coldness the empire brought to the work, because the through line of this whole story runs straight through it. The account was not outthought, no fleet ever beat it in a general action, and no port it held was ever stormed while it cared to fight. It was strangled by a state apparatus deployed at every weak joint at once. Pardons to split the reconcilable from the rest, naval convoys in African and Caribbean stations to raise the cost of every cruise, overseas courts to make death immediate and local, gibbets to advertise it, rising merchant wages to dry the recruiting pool, and beneath all of it, an iron political consensus, shared by empires otherwise at each other's throats, that this particular enemy could not be lived with. The pirates had never threatened to invade anything. They threatened something costlier. Every captured logbook and tavern deposition carried the same intolerable data outward to the fleets in the docks, that the lash was not the price of the sea, that wages could be shares, that captains could be made and unmade like parish constables. The remedy applied for a decade with the whole weight of the Atlantic world was to make the lessons teachers extinct. It worked. The sea was swept, the trade boomed, the wooden world sailed on under its old law for another century, and the press gang and the cat-o'-nine-tails outlived everyone in this story. All that escaped the sweep was paper, articles entered as evidence, trial minutes filed, depositions bound, and one strange London book already at the printers as fly dropped. And paper, the empire would slowly discover, makes a long burning fuse. The book that saved the evidence appeared in London in 1724, between the hangings, under the name of a Captain Charles Johnson, a name that belonged to no traceable captain, and behind which the author still hides. For much of the 20th century, the confident guess was Daniel Defoe. Scholars have since largely taken the attribution apart without agreeing on a replacement, and the mystery suits the book, because a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates is itself double-faced. Half of it is journalism of a high order. The author worked from trial proceedings, admiralty depositions, newspaper accounts, and dockside interviews, and where the records survive to check him, his facts hold up startlingly often. The other half is theater, invented speeches, novelistic childhoods, a second volume that wanders into open fable. The age could not get enough of it. It went through edition after edition, was translated and pirated across Europe, and fixed forever which names this story would be told with. Nearly everything the world thinks it knows about pirates descends from that one anonymous book, including, preserved whole and word for word like a fly in amber, the articles of Bartholomew Roberts' company. That preservation was the book's great accident. Johnson printed the Constitution entire, the equal vote, the equal provision, the two-share captain, the $800 for a limb, the musician's Sabbath, and editorialized around it in tones of fascinated alarm, observing that the pirates managed their affairs by something dangerously like the consent of the governed. He had company in that alarm. The trial courts had entered articles into evidence as proof of criminal combination, and governors' letters home described sea villains who held councils and called their plunder a Commonwealth stock. The enemies of the account, between them, archived it. The men themselves, hanged or scattered, left almost nothing in their own hands, a few depositions, a few gallows speeches taken down by hostile pens, marks on paper made with tarred fingers. Everything else we know because the institutions that killed the floating republic could not stop writing it down. What the world did with the archive was bury it in costume. The transformation took a century and a half, and is its own strange history. Johnson's criminals became the Romantics' doomed rebels, and then the Victorians' boys' adventure furniture, until in 1883, a Scottish novelist named Robert Louis Stevenson, raiding Johnson openly for Treasure Island, gave the legend its final form: the buried chest, the map with the X, the one-legged charmer with the parrot. Almost none of it survives contact with the record. Golden Age pirates buried nothing. Plunder was divided by article and spent at speed. And the sober kid story behind the legend involved one small cache, promptly dug up by the authorities. No reliable Golden Age account has a prisoner walking the plank. The era's crews killed when they killed, without ceremony. Treasure maps are fiction outright. Even Johnson's own darkest invention, a pirate utopia called Libertalia, planted on Madagascar in his second volume, complete with speeches about liberty, is now generally read as a fable, the politics of the real account dressed as a romance, because the politics, stated plainly, were too strange to print as fact. Layer by layer, the legend performed a quiet ideological burial. It kept the violence and the silver, made the freedom a costume, and dropped the Constitution entirely. A child today can draw the flag who has never heard that the men under it voted. Strip the costume, and stand the facts in a row, and what the record actually preserves is this. Between about 1716 and 1726, several thousand of the lowest status working men in the Atlantic world, flogged sailors, runaway servants, escaped and freed slaves, the pressed and the starved of a dozen nations, operated, in the cracks between empires, a working political order of their own design. Its members chose their leaders by ballot and removed them the same way. They divided power on purpose between rival elected offices, reserved war and peace to the assembly of all, ate from one stock, paid the top of their hierarchy 2 shares to the bottoms 1, compensated their wounded from a common fund before any profit was taken, and wrote the whole arrangement down, signed it, and swore to it. Law made binding not by a king's seal, but by the consent of everyone it would bind. Ashore in that same decade, no nation on earth elected its executive. The franchise of England belonged to perhaps 1 man in 6, and the enslaved had, in law, no personhood at all. The Pirates' Republic held elections on the open sea with electorates that included the African-born, and it is true, and must be said in the same breath, that it also sold Africans by the shipload when the ledger pointed that way, and burned 80 of them chained at Whydah. It was not a paradise. It was something rarer in the record and more instructive, a democracy invented by the desperate, working with the lights on where everyone could see it. That visibility is the key the whole story turns on, and it is why the ending was never in doubt. The empires of the age could absorb robbery. They priced it into every cargo, as they priced the weather. What they could not absorb was demonstration. Every merchant crew that defected at the sight of the black flag, every Navy deserter retaken with a share ledger in his sea chest, every fly lecturing the dockside from the scaffold about wages, carried the same message into the only minds that mattered, the 100,000 working sailors on whom every fleet, every colony, and every counting house in the Atlantic depended. It does not have to be like this. A state can negotiate with greed. With proof, it can only do what the Atlantic states in fact did, converge, across a decade, every instrument of mercy, money, law, and rope they possessed, until the proof was extinct. They were not punishing theft, they were burning a library. One book of it survived the fire, and the long joke of the story is who the unwitting librarians were, the judges who entered the articles into evidence, the clerk at Cape Coast Castle, filing the proceedings while the gibbets were dressed on the headlands, the furious minister printing Fly's last words to refute them, the anonymous chronicler embalming the Constitution between adventure stories, every one of them an officer of the order the pirates had defied, and every one of them, in the act of condemnation, a copyist. The iron cages at the harbor mouths did their work for a generation, and then rusted into the tide, and the heads came down from the poles, and the sea roads forgot where the warnings had stood. The paper is all still there, in the archives at London and Kingston and Boston, in a book that has never been out of print. The sheet signed below decks by lantern light goes on saying, to anyone who reads past the skull on the cover, the thing it was written to say, and the thing its signers were hanged for proving, every man has a vote. The cage at the harbor mouth did its work, and then it rusted. Within a few years of the last great hangings, the chains came down, the bones went into the tide, and the empires went back to the quieter violence of the press gang and the pay ticket. By 1730, a sailor could cross the Atlantic for a year and never see a black flag. The experiment was over, and no government on earth mourned it. But the paper survived. The articles read aloud at Cape Coast Castle went into the record books. The trial minutes went into the archives. The strange book of 1724 went into every library in Europe and has never been out of print. Inside them, preserved like an insect in amber, sits the thing itself. One man, one vote. Leaders chosen by the led and removed by them. Equal pay written down. The wounded compensated before anyone else took a coin. Sailors who could not write their own names had worked out, on a wet deck, between one prize and the next, most of what philosophers were still arguing in candlelit rooms. The empires hanged them and kept the silver. The piles of pieces of 8 melted back into the world's ordinary money. The pirates did not cause the revolutions that came 2 generations later. Their republic drowned without an heir. They are something stranger than ancestors. They are proof of how early it was possible that the men at the very bottom of the age of kings, given one unwatched stretch of ocean, chose votes, shares, and written law. The gallows could kill the men. The idea could hold its breath underwater for 300 years.